more in details about the panels and also the topic of today's discussion. So, Mrs. Fadia, the floor is yours today.
All right. Thank you so much, Umaira. Can you hear me?
Sorry, I think your voice is not really
Okay. Can you hear me
clear.
now?
Yeah,
Is it better now?
yeah, I think
Ah,
it's good
all
for
right.
everyone, right?
I
Okay,
can hear you. It's fine, I
Okay,
okay,
think.
that's
cool.
good.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Umaira and Imran, for inviting me to moderate today's discussion. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists for today's webinar. Our first speaker is Dr. Helen Yaffe, Professor of Latin American Political Economy at the University of Glasgow. She is the author of the book We Are Cuba, How a Revolutionary People Have Survived in a Post-Soviet World. If you haven't read the book, you should. And our second speaker is Sara Larijani. She is a doctoral fellow at the University of Tehran, whose work focuses on the history of colonialism and imperialism in Iran. Welcome, Dr. Sara and Dr. Helen. And our discussion today will be divided into three parts. And the first one is the part where we examine the context in which US imperialist aggression operates against Cuba and Iran. And the second part of the discussion will look at the impact of economic sanctions on Cuba and Iran. And the third part of the discussion will explore the forms of resistance put forward by Cuba and Iran. And each speaker will be given 10 to 15 minutes to respond to each question. So I would like to start by posing this question to Dr. Helen on the context of US aggression against Cuba. So, as a socialist project, Cuba has often been portrayed by the United States and Western media as a failed authoritarian state. What are the implications of this dominant narrative, and what does it obscure?
Okay, thank you very much. Can I start by thanking the organisers? Thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm also going to make an appeal to the audience. I'm a university teacher, I'm a professor, and I went through COVID, which was very difficult teaching when all you could see was black screens. And yeah, one of you's already got my question in advance. It would be fantastic if some of you could turn on your screens. I understand that some people are in a place where they can't, but it's lovely to feel that you're actually talking to real people and not to yourself. So if you can turn your camera on, that's much appreciated. Thank you to those of you who are. So so going back to the question, I mean, I grew up I'm British. I grew up in Britain and I got interested in Cuba. The first thing I learned about Cuba was the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is part of the school curriculum, right? And then at the age of 18, I went off to live in Cuba with my big sister during the middle of the 1990s, which was their severe economic crisis, the prior economic crisis after the collapse of the socialist bloc. I think someone's turned their camera on and it's taken over the screen. So whoever that is. um, so yeah, and then I started to study Cuba. And when I went to study, I got the reading lists, right, of the English language, mainstream media, mainstream sort of academia. And hold on, I'm trying to change the view because now I can just see myself really big. Anyway, so when this what I realized is that the English language academic literature on Cuba was all working within the same paradigm of interpretation, right? And then I started to look into it when I started my PhD, which was on the economic ideas and work of Ernesto Che Guevara. I'm sure you've all heard of him, but maybe you don't associate him with that gritty, difficult work of actually, managing an economic, social, and political transition from a semi colonial capitalist country to an independent socialist state, right? Just 90 miles from the shore of the United States. So he was really important in that transition, which he was clear was in some ways more difficult than the actual revolution. So I looked into this Cubanology and I started to find out because Cubans had written about this that actually this was a strategic plan, right? So what had happened is the Cuban Revolution took place on, we all know, the 1st of January 1959. And Batista fled with his cronies and they packed the suitcases of cash and they left the country. And, no one took it that seriously. They thought it was an irritation that could be removed quite quickly. But after the Bay of Pigs invasion, which the Cubans call Playa Giron, when, Cuban exiles were supported, trained, some of them financed by the CIA and other US interests to invade Cuba, and they thought they could easily overthrow the revolutionary government, and it was defeated in 72 hours. It's like a wound that the United States has never got over. And we can talk about, their vengeful attitude to Cuba. They're totally unforgiving, which is expressed today, exemplified today by the attitude and the endeavor of Marco Rubio to carry out a silent genocide against the Cuban people with the oil blockade and so on. So after the Bay of Pigs, Cubans robustly defeated the invasion in 72 hours. They rounded up prisoners and they swapped them for baby food. I mean, it was a total humiliation for the United States. And then the Pentagon, the State Department, the Ford Foundation, which has very strong links to the CIA, started to recognize that Cuba was a more difficult and complex enemy. And in order to understand it and to combat it, they would need research institutes that were set up, right, dedicated to two endeavors. The first objective was to rubbish all of the achievements that Cuba was making, right, to discredit them, so that people wouldn't be inspired by Cuba. If you think about this, Cuba had human development indicators on a par with Haiti, today. And within one generation, so I'm talking about like the mid to late 1980s, one generation of the Cuban Revolution, they had human development indicators that were on a par with the advanced capitalist countries or the imperialist countries, right? And what kind of example does that show to the impoverished masses around the world in capitalist countries, colonized under exploitation of imperialism? It's an extremely dangerous example to, to the people of the world, right? Both in the capitalist imperialist countries and in the global south. So, on the one hand, distract from their achievements and build negative narratives so people don't look to Cuba as an example. And on the other hand, to actually use scholars, academics, to provide information that could then be used to plan actions. Right. And this goes from the extreme. So you can have this school of interpretations called Cubanology. So you can have right wing and left wing Cubanologists, but, they might have subtleties of differences in their interpretation, but they all stick with the key tenets, right? The revolution of 1959 disrupted a process of natural development that would have led to prosperous capitalism. Fidel Castro, then Raúl, personally dominated all decision making and policy making, as if Fidel was, running around doing everything himself. They never talked about anyone except Fidel. The way to understand changes in Cuban policy is actually about Fidel Castro's biological stage. So he's young and idealist, and then he starts to mature and become a pragmatist. And this stuff, you don't even have to dig deep to see these kind of interpretations, right? So the psychological bent of Fidel Castro somehow determines Cuba's destiny, but not of Ronald Reagan, of George Bush, or any of the previous, US presidents. So those are one of the tenets. The other is that Cuba's economic growth has been negligible. The gains of the revolution have been basically attributable first to Soviet aid, and then it was Venezuelan aid. And so these are the key tenets. And you can have people on the right wing of Cubanology, like Edward Gonzalez, who wrote reports for the CIA to help them develop programs aimed at what they very openly has been their objective of US Cuba policy since 1960, which is regime change. And actually, talking about US policy, I mean, today we are seeing the clearest expression of the policy that was originally laid out in April 1960. And if any of you haven't seen this, it's a one-page document. It's freely available on the internet, and it was written by a man called Lester Mallory, who was a US diplomat. And they're tackling the problem of what to do about Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. And the memo is called The Decline and Fall of Fidel Castro. This is 1960. It's before the major nationalizations. It's before Cuba declares it's a socialist country. And the document recognizes the popularity of the new revolutionary government. And it also recognizes there's some influence of communists in the leadership. Although this is, as I said before, the Cubans have said this is a socialist revolution. And it says that an attempt to invade, actually they try and do this later with the Bay of Pigs, would not be successful. So what we recommend is to use economic warfare against Cuba to to create such difficulty that the population turns against its government, right? And this is the wording they use is to create hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. So what we're seeing today is actually the fulfillment of that policy. They have not been successful for 67 years. And the Cuban Americans, who are relentless, they will not, the right-wing lobby in the United States, they will not compromise. They don't care about humanity, humanitarian issues. They will push and push now. They are desperate to take this policy to its extreme. And what we're seeing is an attempt at genocide, because if you do not allow a country to get any access to oil, when you know it's highly dependent on oil or fuel for transport, you threaten any partners it has internationally that they cannot engage with Cuba. Even donations are being sort of criminalized and so on. Then what you're attempting to do is kill 10 million people on the island. And it doesn't matter what their ideology is, they are all suffering. So the final thing I'll say, because I don't want to overstep I don't know how long I've been talking, but the final thing I'll say is this has been accompanied, this attack, this economic warfare, by, again, a narrative of negative portrayal of Cuba. Cuba is a dictatorship. Cuba violates human rights. Cuba engages in human trafficking when its doctors are serving underserved populations around the world. And you can see that very clearly. The effort is to turn Cuba into a pariah state so that we don't do things like we're doing now, and we talk about the reality and then understand our duty to defend Cuba from this silent genocide and from this imperialist attack. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen, for explaining how this narrative obscures the substance of the socialist project, which is to uphold human dignity. I think that is something that needs to be reiterated over and over again, because the narrative is very dominant out there. And of course, we appreciate your insight on that. Thank you so much. Now, I would like to pose the second question to Dr. Sara Larijani. Analysis emerging from the West often depict Iran as a rogue state governed by irrational Muslim clerics due to its pursuit of a nuclear program as a response to decades of US aggression. Could you please explain the rationales that have driven the Islamic Republic's commitment to this form of resistance, which this discourse actively conceals? You have 10 to 15 minutes to respond to this question.
Hello to everyone, and thank you for being here today. It's an honor to be part of this conversation. When I first received your question, I thought it's definitely more than one question. So I've decided to write them down, and I'm going to read through them because I wanted to show the complexity of the situation and its historical contextualization. So it would be better if it's structured. In the first step that I want to start, I would like to give some minutes to depiction of Islamic Republic of Iran as rugged state. Such portrayals obscure the historical and political context within which the Iranian state has articulated its policies. When examined through a critical anti-colonial lens, these depictions appear less as objective assessment and more as a continuation of long-standing colonial epistemologies. The portrayal of societies in the global south as irrational or immature is a well-established colonial practice. Through the 19th and early 20th century, imperial powers frequently represented colonized people as childlike, brutal, or incapable of self-governance. Political cartoons from the United States depicting Filipinos during the Philippine-American War, British colonial descriptions of Indians as passive and backward, or caricatures of Latin Americans in early 20th century American media all reflects this broader pattern. These representations were not merely cultural artifacts. They served political purposes. By depicting colonized populations as irrational or incapable of modern governance, imperial powers legitimized their own interventions as civilizing missions. Later on, Orientalist scholarship played a crucial role in institutionalizing these narratives. From the 19th century onward, many European scholars depicted Asian and Middle Eastern societies as inherently despotic, static, and resistant to progress without Western guidance. Iran was not exempt from such portrayals. One of the most influential examples is George Curzon. Of course, he was a geographer and academic, but also a colonial agent, and also for a time in the early 20th century, he was also a foreign minister of Britain. He has a very famous book, Persia and the Persian Questions, in 1892, which described Iran as a land where one king rules all, portraying its political system as inherently autocratic and its people as indolent and hostile to European influence. Such descriptions were profoundly ahistorical, ignoring the complex political institutions, intellectual traditions, and social movements that existed within Iranian society. These Orientalist depictions became particularly prominent whenever Iranian society mobilized against imperial influence. In the late 19th century, for instance, Iranian clerics, merchants, and intellectuals protested against major colonial concessions, such as Reuter concessions of 1872 and tobacco concession granted to Major Talbot in 1890. These protests, especially the movement of 1891 to 92 against the tobacco concession, represented some of the earliest large-scale anti-colonial mobilization in modern West Asia. Yet, rather than recognizing these movements as rational responses to economic exploitation and imperial domination, many Western observers dismissed them as irrational religious agitation led by reactionary clerics. This discursive pattern was not accidental. It was closely linked to the logic of imperial frontier making. In the 19th century, the expansion of the United States across North America generated a powerful ideological framework that justified territorial expansion by depicting frontier population as uncivilized and in need of control. This logic of frontier making gradually became embedded in broader imperial practices, also used in British ideology and language of imperial expansion, and also France. The idea that imperial powers had the right and even the obligation to intervene in supposedly backward regions informed policies ranging from direct colonial annexation to forms of economic and political control. In West Asia, the frontier making usually operated through economic concessions, political interventions, and epistemological domination. Iran experienced all three forms through the 19th and 20th century. Imperial powers sought influence through economic concessions, oil agreements, and political manipulation. At the same time, Western narratives about Iranian society reinforced the idea that external intervention was necessary. Viewed within this longer historical trajectory, contemporary depictions of Islamic Republic as rogue state appear less as neutral description and more as updated versions of an imperial discourse. The persistence of this narrative is partly explained by modern media dynamics, visual contrasts between images of pre-revolutionary Iran, often emphasizing the westernized lifestyle of elite under the Shah, and post-revolutionary images of a society that openly integrates religion into politics and policies of everyday life, have been widely used to reinforce the idea that Iran has regressed into irrationality and religious sectarianism. Such imaginaries circulated through global media networks have proven effective in shaping public perception, even though it often obscured the political and historical realities that ignited the revolution. Now, to your other questions that were embedded in this, regarding the Iranian nuclear program and this being a base for calling Iran a rogue state. In Western analysis, Iran is often treated as a country pursuing nuclear technology for its ideological extremism, tendency to violence, or irrational defiance. Yet, historically, Iran's nuclear program did not originate after the Islamic Republic. It began during the reign of the last Shah Pahlavi as part of a modernization project that actually enjoyed some Western support. But after the 1970 revolution, this continuation of this nuclear program was received badly. The leadership of the Islamic Republic of Iran has articulated religious objection to nuclear weapons, most notably through a fatwa declaring the production and use of such weapons incompatible with Islamic ethical principles. But we don't hear about these data in Western media. And regardless of how one evaluates this statesman politically and their intentions, their embedded meanings, they demonstrate that the issue cannot be reduced to a fanatic urge to build bombs and blow up other people, which we hear every day in Trump's rhetoric and White House tweets. More importantly, the strategic rationale behind the Islamic Republic of Iran's policies becomes clearer when viewed in the context of Iran's modern history of anti-colonial resistance. So now getting to your last question, since the 19th century, Iranian political movements have repeatedly mobilized against imperial domination. The struggle against economic concession, as I just mentioned, in the 19th century, then the constitutional movement, early 20th century, resistance to 1919 Anglo-Persian agreement, which was basically would turn Iran into a client state of England, Britain at the time, and later campaigns surrounding oil sovereignty all reflected a broader demand for national independence. The nationalization of Iran's oil industry under Prime Minister Mossadegh in 1951 was perhaps the most prominent expression of this aspiration. This subsequent CIA and MI6-backed coup of 1953, which overthrew Mossadegh and restored the Shah's authority, profoundly shaped Iranian political consciousness. Following the coup, the Shah regime consolidated power through extensive repression while aligning closely with Western strategic interests. The 1954 oil consortium restored the control over Iranian petroleum resources by British and American oil companies. So And then the domestic opposition, whether from religious mobilization, patriotic forces, or socialist movement, was systematically suppressed. Iranian forces uh, during the Shah's reign were even deployed to support Western allied regional interventions, such as assisting Sultan of Oman against the Zofar in the movement in that country. For many Iranian revolutionaries, these historical experiences reinforced the observation that Iran's sovereignty was deeply constrained by imperial powers and this must change. Do you hear me? I think my internet connection is not
Yeah,
that
we can
stable.
hear you now. You
Sorry.
got cut off a little bit. Yeah, we can hear you now.
How
Thank
much
you.
time do I have?
You have 5 more minutes.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
So maybe we can also talk a little bit about the after the revolution and experiences. The central slogans of the Iranian Revolution in 1979 was sovereignty, freedom, and the establishment of a Islamic republic. This part. The second part, the republic, is mostly missed when we are hearing about what this state is about. The specific ideological form of the new political order was shaped by several factors. Iranian society was overwhelmingly Muslim, and religious networks have played a crucial role in mobilizing the revolution against the Shah and advancing their resistance. Clerical leaders, particularly Ayatollah Khomeini, had gained credibility through decades of opposition to imperial influence and authoritarian rule of Shah. By contrast, for the majority of Iranian population who were Muslim, secular political movements were often perceived as culturally dependent on Western models, Western ideas, and therefore may undermine the country's sovereignty once in power, even when their agendas were strongly anti-imperialist. The early years of the Islamic Republic further reinforced the leadership's emphasis on strategic autonomy. Only months after the revolution, Iraq invaded Iran in a war that would last 8 years, the longest war of the 20th century. The conflict was widely supported politically, financially, and militarily by several Western and regional powers that viewed the revolutionary state as a danger to the status quo. For Iranian revolutionaries now in power, the war became a difficult and illuminating experience. It demonstrated the vulnerability of the revolutionary state in front of imperial military complex as well as biased global governance. It thus highlighted the necessity of developing independent military capabilities, particularly forms of asymmetric defense that could compensate for conventional disadvantages. From this perspective, Iran's broader strategy of resistance, whether in sovereign military development, regional alliances, or technological self-sufficiency, reflects a particular reading of history, as well as the burden of hundreds thousands of lives lost during and after the revolution for the revolution to survive. Moreover, Iraq war unveiled another reality that the imperial core feared if the Iranian revolution appeared successful in asserting sovereignty against external influence, it might inspire similar movements elsewhere in the global south. The rational conclusion by Iranian revolutionaries was that genuine political sovereignty would inevitably provoke pressure from dominant global powers, especially if it involved control over strategic resources such as oil and decisive geographies and trade routes. This expectation of external hostility contributed to a strategic doctrine emphasizing deterrence, asymmetric capabilities, and partnership with other actors resisting US regional dominance and the Zionist settler colonial expansion in West Asia. I just want to add at the end of my talk that, of course, there is a bold religious impact in the formation of this, but as it is outside my expertise, I would rather leave it maybe to another person later on explains how Shia Islam impacted the formation of this alliance and also the regional resistance front. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sara, for emphasizing the colonial roots of these racist Orientalist narratives, which seek to delegitimize the legitimate resistance put forth by Iran. I would like now to ask a question to Dr. Yaffe in relation to economic sanctions. So could you explain what the economic sanctions on Cuba entail and how they continue to adversely affect Cuba's economy, healthcare system, and everyday life, and what functions do these sanctions serve, both materially and ideologically, and how is Cuba resisting them?
Okay, so could you let me know when I've spoken for 10 minutes? Because this is such a big topic. The
Sure.
first thing to say is that economic warfare that I described in Lester Mallory's memorandum started before the formal embargo, as they call it in the United States. So it started with the cutting off of the United States had a sugar quota that it said to each country with which it had sort of semi-colonial relations, this is how much sugar we'll take from you, and they reduced that and they dropped the remaining amount from the quota, and then they instructed their businesses to not cooperate and so on. And then the Soviet oil arrived at the oil refineries, which were US and British owned, and they, the US government instructed them not to refine it. So that was economic warfare before formal embargo. So let me deal with this question, because I don't call it an embargo, I call it a blockade. And there is a sort of legal and political difference. And you can tell people's position on Cuba partly by whether they use the term embargo or blockade. So an embargo is the right of any country. The government can say, people can't use our ports to trade with this specific country. And is under their own jurisdiction. A blockade is when your one country's policy actually obstructs trade with the other country, but also with third parties. And the embargo, which I call blockade, of the United States has actually been extraterritorial. That means it affects third countries since practically the beginning. And the way it did that is it said, right, we don't allow trade with Cuba. Fine, that's your embargo. That's its right. But then it said any country that supports Cuba or trades with Cuba will withdraw aid. Right? So these are the kind of mechanisms that the US blockade has used. And it's now got to such an extreme level that the 1st of May executive order by Trump, which this is the second executive order of the year. So the first one was on the 29th of January. The first one declared that Cuba was a threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States, which is patently absurd if we're thinking in terms of a military threat. The only way that Cuba can be understood as a threat to the United States is in that sense that I explained before, a threat of a good example, right? Threat of like a public healthcare system delivered on the basis of need, prioritizing human beings rather than rationed through the market, right? So you can only afford medical care if you can pay for it and so on. The second executive order of the 1st of May, and incidentally, the timing is on purpose. On the 1st of May, 5 million Cubans of a population of 10 million around the country went out and celebrated or demonstrated on International Workers' Day, right? 1st of May. And this is despite the fact that there's no fuel for transport. It was a big struggle for people to get to the meeting point in Havana or wherever. But people around the country protested to defend their revolution. And they also signed a petition. Millions of Cubans signed a petition to, defend sovereignty and opposed the US oil siege and the blockade. So the point is, the second executive order was followed by a set of sanctions on the 7th of May, which carried the extraterritorial character of the US blockade to its extreme. Any entity or individual in any country, anywhere in the world that engages with Cuba can now be subject to punitive sanctions and punishment from the United States. Now, the US is, the globally leading economy. Arguably, China's, snapping at its heels, but it controls the international financial system. And this, I'm sure, in the case of Iran and the case of the other, I don't know, it's over 50 countries that are sanctioned by the United States. This is the main mechanism for its leverage. It weaponizes its control over the international financial system. So the US dollar is the international currency. The Washington Post explained that I think in 2019, 89, nearly 90% of international trade was carried out in the dollar, right? So it's an international currency, but at the same time, the United States can decide, because it's a US, they control its the production of dollars, the printing of dollars. They can decide who can and can't hold the dollar, transact with the dollar, right? So that's the way they implement sanctions. And for example, I'll give you, I just wanted to make actually a broader point about what we call the blockade. It is not one piece of legislation. The blockade is a set of laws that have been incremented over the years. So it's something like 6 main statutes of legislation. Some things are overlapping and contradictory and all the rest of it. But in 1996, a new set of laws was introduced called the Helms-Burton Act. And one of the measures of that was that the US embargo blockade was embedded in the US Constitution. So it was no longer in the capacity of a president to sign, previously to that, they could sign a declaration just to remove those sanctions. And that's why, Obama, in his final 2 years, when he was desperate to have some sort of legacy, and he entered rapprochement with Cuba, and he said, I think the embargo should be lifted, but he couldn't do it because he would have required a vote in Congress, and he didn't believe that he would get that, so he didn't take it to Congress. So that's the first thing. It's a very complex web of different financial instruments, of trade instruments, of basically brute force. But in addition to that, there's the sort of coercive measures. So I'll give you an example. During COVID, when Cuba's sending brigades to help combat, it's sending its disease specialists, its epidemiological specialists to countries all over the world. And the United States is picking up the phone and saying to the state, you might want to think about doing that because you've got a lot of trade with us that could be impacted if you bring Cuban doctors in to save lives, right? Those are the kind of coercive measures. So, to explain, I like to explain it in this way because it seems so abstract. How does it work, the blockade, right? As I said, I'm in Britain, I'm a British citizen, I have a British bank account. Now, UK law, British law, since 1980 has had legislation that says it's illegal for the US to impose its embargo on us. We're not subject to US jurisdiction. And the the British law has protected the right of British citizens and entities to trade with Cuba. It doesn't take the same hostile attitude. It also doesn't oppose the US, right? So this law was increased after that Helms-Burton Act. Britain passed more legislation saying it's illegal to apply the Helms-Burton Act against British citizens and entities. The European Union did the same. Canada did the same. Brazil did the same. The United Nations encouraged countries around the world to have legislation to protect their citizens so they could continue to trade with Cuba or exchange with Cuba. Cuba does a lot of scientific exchanges. There's the medical programs, art, culture, and all sorts of stuff. However, they don't enforce the law. And what that means is that the US can simply say, Cuba's on our sanctioned list, and if any entity, whether it's a corporation or a financial institution, engages with Cuba, we'll just sanction you. And because the British government or the EU government won't take a legal action and won't implement its own legislation to block that, the US blockade is a global blockade against Cuba. And it's absolutely suffocating. As I said, British citizen with a British bank account. If I send £1 to someone in Europe, right, to convert it into euros, and I put the word Cuba anywhere in that transaction, in the reference or the address, yeah, that transaction will be blocked, even though it hasn't been converted into US dollars and it hasn't been sent to Cuba. So now, if you see how that affects me, and it affects me personally, because I've tried to engage with academics on projects in Cuba, and my university says, oh no, our bank won't allow that, right? So it's effect is in every single sector. And now you imagine being the Cuban government, which is a small island nation. So it's dependent on trade, whether Cuba's capitalist or socialist, it's always going to be dependent on trade because it doesn't have all the natural resources it needs. Plus, it engages with the world through its, incredible, innovative science and technology, its culture and art and so on. So can you imagine, even when the Cubans have sent medical services overseas, the payments they should receive are blocked, for example, by Commerzbank, which did a transaction when Cubans sent maternity services to Algeria. Yeah. So this is repeated every single day in every single sector. I have studied Cuban development in different sectors. I've looked at sustainable development and climate change adaptation. I've looked at biotechnology. I've looked at all different sectors, and everywhere you look and you interview people, they can tell you how the US blockade has impeded their ability to import the best and latest technology, to exchange with people, to establish partnerships. And it's absolutely, it does make a difference on life. And I just want to say about on this question of the impact on human beings, right? Because this is not a technical issue. So for many years, people would ask me, like I'd have journalists saying, like, what evidence is there that the US blockade kills people in Cuba? And the answer was very little, because as the Cuban government is a socialist state, it's been impacted, its development, its wealth, its technology, as I said, infrastructure, but it has channeled its resources towards the vulnerable. That's the way that Cuban policy, even now when they're, introducing economic reforms, the point is to say, if we have no wealth in this country, we cannot direct them towards protection of those in need, right? So the point is that for many years, it was not very clear to be able to say, this is the blockade and these are those who die. If you compare that to, for example, the blockade, the sanctions against Iraq, yeah, that were killing, UNICEF said, 150 children every day in the 1990s. And that was charted. Now, what happened is when the second Trump administration came in, 2017, and then they started to augment, to increase and intensify sanctions on Cuba to pursue what they openly called maximum pressure strategy. And then you started to see, as this dovetailed with COVID, yeah, people dying as a direct response of the US sanctions. So Cuba, wonderful science. I mean, it's quite extraordinary, innovative science. I don't want to talk too long about it, but they've led the world in lung cancer immunotherapy. They now have a Alzheimer's drug, which is extremely promising. It's improving cognitive ability, not just slowing down decline. They were the first in the world with a meningitis B vaccine, the first to eliminate mother-to-child HIV transmission, the first with a human synthetic antigen. It's quite extraordinary for a small, colonized, blockaded, previously colonized, 400 years of colonialism and imperialism, and then blockaded. And they've achieved all this, right, just by prioritizing, science and technology, not for private profit, but for social development. And yet, so they were the only country in Latin America and the Caribbean to develop COVID-19 vaccines. Probably some of you know that. And yet they couldn't get the syringes needed to vaccinate their population. Why? Because if you remember, US companies were going around the world buying up all of the manufacturers of PPE and syringes and so on. And they couldn't get the syringes because the manufacturers, even if they're German and they're bought out by a subsidiary of the US, they cannot sell to Cuba. And Cuba had a...
Sorry to interrupt. 5 more minutes.
Okay. Cuba had, a surge of COVID. Its hospitals were overrun for the first time. They've never seen their public healthcare service system overwhelmed. Then their only medical oxygen plant broke down. And they asked the US, please allow us to buy replacement parts so that we can provide oxygen for our patients who are dying. And the US refused. And now, if you look at infant mortality in Cuba, as I said, those are one of the indicators which give me the ability to say that Cuba was similar to Haiti before the Cuban Revolution. The infant mortality rate has plummeted. It's come right down. It's extraordinary. And infant mortality is a really key indicator because it reflects the mother's health and diet, care of, that they don't have to work while they're heavily pregnant. They have these homes for pregnant women if they need it, and it reflects infrastructure of public health and so on. Their infant mortality came down to below 4 per thousand, which is extraordinary, right? It's comparative with the best countries in the world. It's better than the United States. But not only that, the 4 per thousand was the shared nationally, right? So there's not that difference that you see. Like the US has 7 point something, but the difference between rural and urban areas is huge, right? So, or, poor Black communities or immigrant communities in the US have much higher infant mortality than the wealthy white communities. So in Cuba, it's actually sometimes better in rural areas. And what's happened to their infant mortality? It's almost doubled in the last few years since the United States has pursued a maximum pressure policy. And so 1,000 babies have died as a direct consequence of this US blockade under Trump since 2019. And now there are over 100,000 people who are on lists for surgery, but they can't get them because there's no oil. The Cuban hospitals have had to close to all but emergency treatment. The schools, the universities, people can't, even if the hospitals are open, people can't get the transport to get them to the hospitals. So, these are the effects of sanctions. They are international. They affect everyone. They violate the rights of all of us, and they violate the human rights of Cubans. They are killing Cubans, and they are the biggest obstacle to development in Cuba. And to have that scenario and at the same time listening to Marco Rubio deny that there's a blockade and blame all of Cuba's problems and inefficiencies on the Cuban government is just an insult. And, I think it's really important that this is why I focus my work on showing what Cubans have been able to achieve under this blockade. And you just left to think, what on earth would they be able to achieve if they weren't just struggling to survive and if they were actually given the space to breathe and to prosper? I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Helen, for shedding light on the distinction between a blockade and also an embargo, because that allows us to see with clarity that economic sanctions are a form of violence. I see someone raise their hand. We're going to open the floor for question and answers later after all the 3 rounds of discussion are concluded. So my next question for Dr. Sara is, economic sanctions are often presented as an alternative to war. And in the context of Iran, how have sanctions affected ordinary citizens and shaped domestic policy? And how do these sanctions maintain US imperial hegemony and impede Iran's sovereignty?
In responding to this set of questions, related to sanctions, I would like to draw on research of my colleague Taha Zainali and a conceptual framework that we have developed together based on his recent work. The framing of sanctions as an alternative to war is perhaps the most successful propaganda operation of the modern era. It has enabled what is fundamentally an act of warfare to be presented as a peaceful, even humanitarian policy instrument. Sanctions are not an alternative to war. They are a form of warfare. What we have witnessed in the past year alone demonstrates precisely how sanctions and military action are integrated component of a single coercive strategy. The sanctions regime that had been crippling Iran's economy for years did not prevent military strikes. It preceded them, accompanied them, and was then supplemented by them. What my colleague Taha Zainali conceptualized is an imperialist hybrid warfare, which is precisely this synergic integration of economic coercion with diplomatic isolation, military threats and operations, covert actions, cyber attacks, and information warfare. The case of Iran illustrates this comprehensively. Between 2009 and 2012, the sanction regime intensified dramatically. We experienced secondary sanctions by US, SWIFT disconnections, oil embargoes, but this was never a purely economic campaign. It was accompanied by stock-next cyber attacks, a campaign of assassinations of nuclear scientists, continuous military threats, and a sophisticated information war. And what we have witnessed in the last year was this pattern being intensified. So sanctions are war fought through other means. The economic spearhead of imperialist strategy designed to generate material deprivation and social fractures that other coercive measures then exploit. To present them otherwise is not merely analytically inaccurate. It is to participate in legitimizing what remains at its core an act of warfare against civilian population. So answering your question about how the sanction affected ordinary citizens. It was devastating and it intensified in the last 15 years. What we are witnessing is not a side effect of economic pressure. It is the intended logic of siege warfare to maximize suffering among civilian population to generate political pressure then on the targeted government. Maybe I can start with the most urgent dimension, as what also Helen was talking about, health. The pharmaceutical sector in Iran has faced critical shortages as international suppliers refused to risk secondary sanctions. What it was just explained here by Helen was the impact of secondary sanctions. So maybe just to explain, U.S. does not do any economic relations, for example, with Iran and Cuba. But if, for example, a bank in England or a bank in China or a company in China do trade with Iran or has financial relations with Iran, then U.S. would sanction that company. It was not taken seriously at the beginning when it started against Iran. I think it was around 2009, 2010. But then U.S. actually find Deutsche Bank, like one of the largest banks on earth, and some other multinational industries for having relations with Iran. And that was like, oh, that's going to really happen. And after that, secondary sanctions were really effective. So it was just in parenthesis. And where I was, yes, the secondary sanctions I was talking about. I have to find it again in my text. So studies have documented that these sanctions led to critical shortage of life-saving medicine for approximately 6 million Iranian patients, with 44% of affected drugs classified as essential medicines by the World Health Organization. The humanitarian exemptions that were supposedly built into the sanction regime have failed systematically, not by accident, but because private sector risk aversion and banking restrictions make compliance prohibitively expensive. During the COVID-19 pandemic, this dynamic was exposed brutally. Banking restrictions crippled Iran's pandemic response. Deliveries from the World Health Organization were held up due to sanction-related banking restrictions. The comparative resilience of the Iranian health system was also crippled by these sanctions, and there were limited access to particular medicine for rare disease, even when these were domestically produced. Children, the elderly, the patients with chronic disease have been disproportionately affected. Economically, sanctions squeezed hard currency revenue, created budget deficits that translate into inflation, currency depreciation, and real wage compressions. When the real collapsed, wages, real is Iran's currency, if someone doesn't know, wages and savings were eroded. Imported medicines, medical equipment, specialized foodstuff become too expensive or simply unavailable. The crisis of everyday life was experienced as the inability to afford basic necessities, the uncertainty of whether a hospital will have the medicine needed for treatment, the erosion of savings that were meant to provide security. Importantly, sanctions do not affect everyone equally. They deepen and intensify existing class hierarchies. Urban informal workers, low-income households, and rural communities dependent on subsidized input are hit hardest. At the same time, segments of the capitalist class with access to foreign currency and import licenses are able to profit from arbitrage opportunities created by multiple exchange rates and scarcity. As a result, ordinary Iranians, particularly the working class, bears the heaviest burden. This is not collateral damage. This is the logic of sanctions as siege warfare. As Taan argued in our research, sanctions are designed to systematically target the foundations of social reproduction. The welfare state's capacity to shield the vulnerable is undermined. The state's legitimacy is eroded as it cannot fulfill its social contract. This is the mechanism through which economic coercion translates into political pressure by making life so unbearable that the population demands change and oppose the targeted government rather than the sanctions or the imperialist aggression. So in this context of Iran, how have these sanctions shaped the domestic policy? This question gets to the heart of how sanctions function as political instrument, not just to impose economic costs, but to reconfigure the internal dynamics of the targeted state. In this research, we demonstrated that sanctions as part of a coordinated imperialist strategy fundamentally transformed the relations of force within ruling elite, creating conditions for significant political realignment. The mechanism works through several interconnected dynamics. First, sanctions generate severe economic hardship that affects ordinary citizens. This material suffering becomes the raw material for political contestation. Second, and crucially, sanctions are accompanied by sophisticated information warfare campaigns that frame this hardship not as the result of external question, but as the inevitable consequences of the targeted state's international media, targeted states' own extremism and adventurism. This narrative is amplified through diplomatic messages, international media, and domestic channels sympathetic to the imperial project. Third, this combination of material pressure and ideological framing transformed the train of domestic political struggle. It empowers factions within the ruling establishment that advocate for diplomatic engagement and compromises as the only path to sanctions relief. These factions position themselves as pragmatic and moderate, in contrast to what they portray as the costly and reckless defiance of their opponents and the imperial presence in the region. The discourse of engagement and normalization gains credibility precisely because the cost of defiance have become so visible and so painful for ordinary people. Fourth, the imperial power actively cultivates this dynamic by signaling that meaningful relief and recognition will only be forthcoming if a credible, moderate projects emerge in the country. The imperial power shapes the field of political possibility in the targeted states. This is not regime change through direct intervention. This is a regime transformation through economic coercion and political engineering. How much time do I have left?
You have 4 more minutes.
Great, thank you. The outcome, as we saw in the Iranian case, was a political realignment that enabled the negotiation of an asymmetrical agreement, one that locked in nuclear constraints and preserved the coercive leverage of imperial power through mechanisms like snapback. I'm referring here to the JCPOA, which is the joint framework for the Iranian nuclear agreement during Obama's presidency. And I think it's mainly known by Iran's nuclear deal. I don't know how much you're familiar with the nuclear deal. I can explain a little bit more about that, answering the question of how these sanctions maintain U.S. imperial hegemony and impedes Iran's sovereignty. Sanctions are mechanisms of imperial domination, as we discussed, designed to maintain hierarchical global orders and punish sovereign resistance. At the most basic level, sanctions impose pressure that force the targeted state to compromise its sovereign rights, whether nuclear development, defense capabilities, or regional policy. The so-called Iran's nuclear deal during Obama's administration exemplifies this. Iran accepted irreversible, front-loaded nuclear concession in return for conditional, reversible sanctions relief. The snapback mechanism, meaning that if Iran does not comply, everything comes back, embedded in United Nations Security Council resolution, allowed any P5+1 member, namely China, France, Russia, United Kingdom, United States, plus Germany, to unilaterally reimpose UN sanctions with no meaningful recourse for Iran. Sanctions also function to empower pro-imperialist forces within the targeted state. They create material conditions that delegitimize defiance and make compromise appear rational. As Prabhat Patnaik has argued, the neoliberal economic order, with its free movement of goods, services, and capital, has made sanctions a powerful instrument. Countries have become import-dependent, reliant on foreign investment and financial inflows. This dependence creates vulnerabilities that sanctions can exploit. Here we encounter the profound contradictions at the heart of contemporary imperialism. But when sanctions are imposed on a large number of countries, those countries tend to form alternative arrangements for bypassing such sanctions. These alternative arrangements have the effect of undermining the US-dominated world order characterized by the hegemony of the dollar. The United States' expansive use of financial sanctions has paradoxically accelerated pressure towards the erosion of the liberal economic order. As sanctions proliferate, targets move from short-term evasions to building alternative infrastructures. China's RMB settlement system, CIPS, BRICS financial mechanism, central bank digital currencies, and barter-based trade. This fosters governance decoupling from US-led system and over time erodes US leverage and dollar centrality, hopefully.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sara, for demonstrating both the material and ideological ramifications of economic sanctions on Iran. I would like to proceed with the next question in relation to resistance. So my questions is for Dr. Helen Yaffe. Cuba has pursued what it calls medical diplomacy, which has been integral to its foreign policy since 1960 as part of its commitment to South-South cooperation. Could you explain what underpins this practice and how it challenges global health security and imperialism more broadly?
So the first thing to say is I don't think that Cubans call it medical diplomacy. I think that's what it's called from outside. And, the title medical diplomacy feeds into the narrative that Cuba is helping to save and improve lives around the world for soft power, right? To grow influence and stuff. And I've done a lot of work on this, of Cuba's medical internationalism, which is the term they use. And, it's an argument that doesn't fit with the reality. The people that Cuba has served are the poorest and most vulnerable in the poorest and most vulnerable countries. So it doesn't exactly lead directly to, global leverage or power. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, why do they do it? But, although Cuba was colonized hundreds of years ago, and there has been, particularly from the 19th century, struggles for national sovereignty. But the interesting thing is that Cuban national sovereignty has always been integral or linked to anti-imperialism. And that, it's not so weird if you look at the fact that Cuba was colonized by Spain, which had an empire. So all of the neighboring, islands in the Caribbean, if not under Spanish control, are under other European states' controls, and then Latin America. So there's this really interesting kind of history that the Cuban struggle for independence has always received support from foreigners who were non-Cubans. And, Maximo Gomez, one of the most heroic heroes of the Cuban Revolution, was non-Cuban, Venezuelan and Dominican. And then you had even this guy whose name might ring a bell if you know something about Cuba's medical missions, Henry Reeve, who was a guy from the United States who fought with the Cuban army in one of its three main independence wars, and there were many other uprisings and so on. So, but at the same time, the Cubans have supported the independence struggles of other countries, right? And it's kind of totally natural for Cuba to understand that their struggle for independence is integrated to a broader struggle against colonialism and imperialism. And some of you may have heard of Jose Marti, who is known as the apostle of independence in Cuba. He's the sort of national hero. There's, quite a few important independence leaders, but he's known as the apostle. And he was actually like an intellectual, a writer, a poet, and so on. Traveled around. He grew up. He was a bit younger than the first generations that launched the wars of independence of the second half of the 19th century. But he was the person who like lit the spark again. So he traveled around the United States, what he called the belly of the beast. That's where that expression comes from in relation to Cuba. And he got donations from Cuban exiles to relaunch the independence war. He persuaded the veterans of the previous wars to put aside their differences and to unify into one Cuban Revolutionary Party. This is the Cuban commitment to having a single party of the revolution, which is often associated with, assumed to be to do with authoritarian control, but is actually in their tradition of struggle for independence. And Jose Marti decided to go into battle. He wanted to actually do it, not just write about it or encourage it, right? And, you know, the generals are saying, you're not a soldier, don't go into battle. But he did. He went into battle against the Spanish. And the fascinating thing is the night before his first battle in Cuba against the Spanish, he writes a letter to a Mexican revolutionary. And remember that at this time, I'm talking about, what was it, 1895? And at that time, Mexico in 1848 had lost 1/3 of its territory to whom? The United States. The United States was a burgeoning, fairly new republic. It was supposed to represent, you know, national liberation because it freed itself from English colonialists and had this revolution with this very apparently radical sounding constitution. You know, all men are created free and equal unless they're black, slaves, or, you know, excluding women and so on. So very kind of very select rights for a select few. But Jose Marti, going into battle against the Spanish, writes a letter to this Mexican revolutionary. And who does he warn about? He warns about the neighbors in the north, the United States. And he says, although he should be focused on fighting the Spanish, once we are independent, the next danger will be North America, will be the United States. Because if they can get control of Cuba, which is their objective, they will use Cuba to launch their imperialist projects around the Americas. So he understood that very clearly. If you look at a map, Cuba has an absolutely key geostrategic location. I mean, that's also one of the ways that we can understand this sort of relentless, you know, violations of Cuban sovereignty, because all the European powers, I mean, there were English pirates trying to take over Cuba in 1760 something. And you know, it's sort of like a gateway to many trade routes, right? Where a lot of the wealth of the Americas was sucked out and sent back to Europe, and slaves were carried from Africa. And there's Cuba. It's very strategic location. So the point is that the Cuban Revolution had always had this kind of internationalist dynamic, right? They understood that Cuban independence or national sovereignty was linked to the fate of the rest of the world in terms of imperialist or colonialist subjugation. And so they integrated their own struggle for independence with the struggle against colonialism and imperialism. Now, after the Cuban Revolution, you know, Cuba has something like 6,200 doctors, physicians in the island, and they're sort of part of the system that I talked about before, rationed. It's a commodified system of healthcare, and half of them leave very quickly. So Cuba, which never had enough doctors, although it was one of the highest ratios of Latin America, as its critics will tell you, suddenly has half the number. And yet, almost immediately, they developed this slogan, right? We don't share what we have left over, we share what we have. So 1960, the year after the revolution seizes power, there's a terrible earthquake in Chile. It's the most powerful on record at that time. And the Cubans, despite having hardly any medical personnel, they're rushing to set up the educational infrastructure to train new medics and nurses. They send teams to Chile, and the country, gives blood donations. So that's the first act. Now, they don't even have diplomatic relations with Chile, which is following the US lead and breaking off relations with Cuba, right? So the next thing that happens is they send medics to Algeria while it is fighting for independence from France. They send soldiers, but they also send a team of medics. And they send 54 medical professionals, nurses and doctors. The guy who led that group, who later became the Minister of Health, he describes it as if a beggar was giving what they had. It was like they as I say, they share what they have, not what they have left over. And so when they got to Algeria, then they invited some of the orphans and the injured soldiers back to Cuba. So then they develop a new form of internationalism, which is to treat foreign patients. So you already have emergency brigades, they went to Chile, and then you have the brigade, the setting up to treat patients. And then they have this engagement in Africa, different countries in Africa where they're sending soldiers, they're helping struggles for national liberation or post-colonial states. And whenever they send soldiers, they send medics too. And there's an incredible, almost untold stories about, Cuban doctors who arrive in a place where there's like 650,000 population that have one doctor at that point when they arrive. And then they go there and, they do two things. One is they start to set up public healthcare services and apparatus in those countries. And the other is that they invite people over to Cuba to train to become medical professionals and all sorts of other professionals, by the way. So in the 1970s, Fidel Castro goes on a tour of African countries, which is really key. And he sees the lack of medical provision for populations. And he would like to set up to send Cubans there to train them in their own countries, but they realize that they don't have the infrastructure, they don't have universities or maybe even roads to get people to those universities. So actually, while they do that in some countries, in some places, they realize that the quickest way to do it is to invite tens of thousands of people from Africa, Asia, Latin America into Cuba to get free medical degrees. So this is, the four kind of different types of you can categorize Cuban internationalism in those four types: emergency brigades overseas, treating patients from other countries in Cuba or overseas, setting up public healthcare systems overseas, and training foreigners in Cuba. And this just went on. And there, I've got a whole chapter in my book, We Are Cuba, but there are whole books written just about one mission. For example, the Cubans have sustained over 20,000 medical professionals in Venezuela since the Bolivarian Revolution began and the alliance with Hugo Chavez for over 20 years. And, they've also been to countries where, again, they continue to go to countries where they didn't have diplomatic relations. The terrible earthquake in Kashmir, if you remember, and they sent 32 field hospitals, tons of medicine. They stayed there. The West always does this trumpeting. Oh, we've sent 6 helicopters. They've stayed for a week and then they've gone. And, we don't really, no one will remember. Or, we're all suffering in the West from compassion fatigue. That's actually a term they use. And the Cubans actually stay there for 6 months, but they also train local people or the medics from the army to use. They leave behind their hospital equipment and tents, field hospitals they're called. They train them to use them, they leave them behind. They also gave 1,000 scholarships to Pakistani students to go to Cuba to get this free training. So it's quite a phenomenal story. I mean, on the one level, you have these big numbers. So 600,000 Cubans, 600, remember the population of Cuba? It went up to over 11 million. It's gone down now to under 10 million because of mass migration as a result of these sanctions and just daily hardship. But 600,000, that's over 500,000 Cubans have been in over 180 countries providing medical treatment. Now, the controversy, this has come up recently because I was talking to you about how the current attack, the maximum pressure strategy by the United States, has been accompanied again by a negative narrative about how terrible Cubans are. And it's actually quite difficult for the United States to attack Cuba when it's saving and improving literally billions of lives around the world, literally billions. So you can look at like to 2014, and actually it increased after that date. Cuba had provided, I don't know, 2.5 billion consultations around the world, right? So, and who are the patients? They are the most vulnerable and dispossessed, the most underserved in the poorest countries, the most in need, right? So, how does the US then turn the world against this? Yeah, how does it turn this into a negative thing? Because they're not going to replace the Cuban medics, right? They have a healthcare system which is all about the market, it's commodified and it's rationed and so on and so forth. So they can't do what the Cubans are doing. And also, you know, if you understand the basic laws of demand and supply, in order to keep the price high, you have to have scarcity, right? You have to have a deficit. And the Cubans are going to countries in Latin America where the professional medical associations enjoy high prices. They don't treat poor people because poor people can't afford to be treated. And when the Cubans go there and provide healthcare, which is always free at the point of delivery, in other words, patients don't pay, then that means that you're lowering the value of the professional medics, right? So it's an attack on their own privilege. It's an attack on their standard of living. So instead, they have to create this false narrative. They have to say that these aren't medics. First of all, they say that they're underqualified, they're not proper medics. Then they say, no, they are medics, but they're slaves. Actually, this is a program of human trafficking. I mean, how absurd. They say that the Cubans are forced to go by their government. I mean, the arguments are very contradictory because on the one hand, they say they're forced to go, they're slaves. On the other hand, others are saying, oh, no, they only go because they get higher salaries, which they do. I don't recall that slaves get salaries. They get, I'll explain the reality of how these programs work. So basically, it's totally voluntary. So, you know, their Cuban medics are given the opportunity. They can say there's an opportunity to go to South Africa where they have a lot of medics there running public health. There's an opportunity to go and work in Haiti after the earthquake in 2010. It's an emergency. There's an opportunity to go and fight Ebola, if you remember that, in 2000 and was it 14 or 15 the first time around, where the Cubans sent the largest delegation for longevity that stayed there for 6 months. And they were told by the WHO, the World Health Organization, you're mad, they'll all get infected and die. You know, and they said, no, they won't, because we'll train them properly. They had 10,000 volunteers in Cuba, Cuban professionals, to go. In the end, they selected, I don't know, like 400 and something. They trained them and then only took 250. But 10,000 Cubans risking their lives. This is an illness. Look what's happening now in the Congo, right? This is an illness that can kill 90% of those infected, was killing 50% of the healthcare professionals working in those areas. And the Cubans are like competing with each other to go, right? Because it's part of their mission. It's part of their kind of social education. You know, if you look at the school books of Cuban children, yeah, they talk about seremos como el Che. We will be like Che. What does it mean to be like Che? You know, it means to fight for other people, fight for justice. It means to be an internationalist. Right, because I was talking about internationalism, and of course I forgot this key person who I did my PhD on, Che Guevara, who was Argentinian, traveled around Latin America, met the Cubans, fought with the Cubans, went to the Congo, went to fight in Africa, and then died fighting in Bolivia. So another really important aspect of their internationalism. So this is the point. The Cubans have understood that this poor health is a result of poverty, structural inequality, global inequality, or the inequality of global structures, and essentially of imperialism, right? They've understood that poor health is a response, and they are evidence of it because they introduced a public healthcare system. They massively and very quickly improved the health profile of Cubans. They eliminated mosquito-borne diseases, and poverty-related diseases, infectious diseases. A lot of them coming back now, by the way, because of these terrible conditions, you know, with the rubbish in the street that they can't afford to pick up because they have no fuel, there's no transport for the rubbish trucks. Anyway, they showed what could be done, right? And they regarded the, you know, they were regarded as this part of the same battle. So they were as ready to send soldiers to fight imperialism as to send medics to fight the conditions, the socio-economic or health conditions created by imperialist exploitation and global inequality. And I think that's what we need to understand. Now the controversy has been about, you know, the payment, and this is why the US is targeting Cuban medical internationalism. They didn't bother with it before Cuba received an income from this payment. And, you know, most of it Cuba provided free. I mean, a small island nation blockaded. The blockade was costing in the 1990s, before the collapse of the Soviet bloc, you know, 3 billion. Since then, it's cost 4, 5, 6. It's now up to 7 billion a year, the cost to Cuba of US sanctions. And yet they continue to provide this incredible assistance. Now, there's a Guatemalan researcher who has taken the breakdown of the Cuban medical assistance overseas, and he has used the OECD methodology. When they do health procedures, they give each one an economic value, and he's given an economic value to the medical assistance the Cubans give overseas. And it's extraordinary. He's just looking at 1999 to 2015. The value that Cuba donated through, he calls this overseas development aid, to the global south is equivalent to 6.6% of its GDP. What is it? How does that compare to the United States or Europe? Europe is 0.37% of GDP, and the United States is 0.17% of GDP. So Cuba contributes so much more to the global south, respective of its resources and capacity. And also he calculates that this is worth 4 to 5 billion a year. At the time that he did his research, the blockade was costing the same, 4 to 5 billion every year to Cuba. So conceptually, you can see that without the blockade, Cuba would have the capacity to double its overseas medical assistance, and that's more lives saved, more lives improved, more patients who don't currently have access to to healthcare getting access. So I think your question, your question is like why does it do it? It's part of the Cuban struggle against both imperialism and underdevelopment, which it sees as a product, right, of imperialism, right? Imperialism we don't talk about developing countries. These countries aren't developing. Some of them, if you look at the British impact, the impact of British colonialism in India and in Ireland, they were developing. That development was devastated by British policy, imperialist policy, on purpose. These countries were underdeveloped. And so it's the understanding by Cuba that this is the struggle against imperialism and underdevelopment is a global struggle. And whether that means supporting countries, which Cuba hasn't done since the 1990s, with, soldiers and the military aspect, then or whether that means supporting saving lives and helping to set up public healthcare, it's again that threat of a good example of showing that when the US and the neoliberal model says you have to roll back state spending on education, healthcare, housing and social welfare because it doesn't lead to efficient outcomes. And the Cubans are there saying, actually, we spend less per capita on health and education and far less, like 10%. Cuba spends 10% of what's spent in Britain, and it's more in the United States. And yet they have better or similar healthcare outcomes. Cuba has more has more doctors per person than any other country in the world. And that was the case even when they sent 20 up to 30,000 medics to Venezuela, and even when they had people working in, dozens of countries. Right now, or at least this is a statistic from about 6 months ago when I last checked, despite this economic crisis, despite the maximum pressure, Cuba still has over 50,000 medical professionals working in, sorry, not 50,000, it's down to about 28,000 working in 54 countries, right? Now, what has the US done in response? It's pressured Caribbean countries and Latin American countries, and something like 7 countries have recently announced that they are ending. I mean, when I say recently, I mean since February. Between February and May, this happened. Guatemala ended a contract that it's had with Cuba for 30 years, where,
Sorry, Helen, to interrupt, but could you please conclude your
yeah, I will.
remarks? Thank you.
Yeah, so they've ended this contract where you can see where the Cubans were working, infant mortality has plummeted. And so what's happening is people are dying, not just in Cuba, but around the world because of this vicious, vengeful project, which is designed to stop income to Cuba, which it then plows back into the training of the doctors and to the other programs that it gives to poor countries that cannot afford to pay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen, for elaborating on Cuba's commitment to internationalism. So my last question is for Dr. Sara. Iran has increasingly sought to build relations with states such as Venezuela and Bolivia to undermine the impact of economic sanctions. Could you elaborate on the prospects of this approach in weakening US imperialism?
Yes. Well, this sort of economic and strategic alliances bring me to a critical dimension of resistance. As I briefly mentioned at the last round, South-South cooperation amongst sanctioned states. Iran and Venezuela, both facing US sanctions, have expanded strategic cooperation across energy, trade, technology, and defense sectors. They signed a 20-year strategic cooperation agreement in 2022, covering all these aspects that I just mentioned, plus transportation. To date, while before Trump's administration literal kidnapping of Maduro, the two countries have concluded 299 agreements, underscoring an unusually dense bilateral agenda. Iranian parliament speakers, for example, has characterized the Iran-Venezuela alliance as, and I quote, a paradigm of sovereign resistance against unipolar dominance, end of quote, highlighting South-South cooperation as an alternative to Western hegemony. Iran has also sought to enhance relations with Bolivia, with officials emphasizing that diversification of economic relationships could help mitigate the impact of sanctions. This diversification reflects a broader trend. Latin America has become a focal point for countries like Iran, China, and Russia, who are increasingly active in a region once seen as a United States sphere of influence or the so-called backyard. What are the prospects of this approach in weakening US imperialism? The answer to this question, I would say, is complex and also dialectical. On one hand, cooperation among sanctioned states provides tangible material benefits. Iran has supplied condensated and refinery parts to Venezuela, enabling the revival of its crippled oil industry. Iranian technicians have worked alongside Venezuela's state oil company to rehabilitate the Paraguana refining complex, the largest in Latin America. Iranian oil tankers have delivered light oil for refining and diluents to produce exportable crude grades. For Venezuela, Iran has also inaugurated a fiber optic production plant in Venezuela, aiming to meet domestic needs and with a perspective to become a regional hub for exporting telecommunication equipments to Latin American countries. While these are not symbolic gestures, they represent material infrastructure that enhances the economic resilience of both nations. Now, to acknowledge the limitation of these initiatives. It did not, however, open pathway into Latin America's wider political or economic networks. Networks lacking economic density and institutional cover remain fragile, geographically confined, and heavily dependent on permissive political environment. Yet even these limitations point toward a larger strategic dynamic. The very act of building alternative relationship, however partial, contributes to the erosion of U.S. imperial hegemony over time. Each barter trade agreement, each joint venture, each technology transfer, and each coordinated diplomatic position in international forums represent a small but cumulative challenge to the U.S.-centered order. The Iran-Venezuela partnership exemplified a broader trend of South-South cooperation that was rapidly challenging American hegemony. This was not a linear process. It was uneven, contested, and subject to reversal, of course, as we were seeing, but it was real. So my conclusion on this question is twofold. First, sanctions are instruments of imperial hegemony that impose the development, undermine sovereignty, and empower comprador forces. Second, the overuse of sanctions, their application against dozens of countries simultaneously, generates the condition for their own undoing. It drives the construction of alternative financial architecture, South-South solidarities, and the erosion of the very trust that underpins dollar's hegemony. Iran's cooperation with Venezuela, Bolivia, and other sanctioned states is part of this broader dialectic, a response to imperial pressure that simultaneously challenges the logic of imperial control. This is the contradiction at the heart of contemporary imperialism. The more it weaponizes the global economic order, the more it drives the construction of alternatives that challenges its dominance. The prospects for weakening U.S. imperialism through South-South cooperation are therefore not guaranteed, but they are structurally embedded in the logic of the system itself. So I think my answer to your question was shorter than expected, and maybe our audiences are happy about it. Thank you so much
for sharing that. Yeah, of course, it's not linear, but it's something that deserves more scrutiny and also analysis. Thank you so much for sharing your insights on that. I would like now to open the floor for questions and answers. You can unmute yourself and raise your hand so that I can see you. You can ask questions to our panelists, and you can also type your questions in the chat. There's one question in the chat, maybe I can start with that. This is for both Helen and also Sara. Given that anti-imperialism clearly takes on distinctive forms in different contexts, take the example of Shia resistance in Iran and socialist resistance in Cuba and Venezuela, would it be accurate to say that the path of revolutionary anti-imperialist praxis is not simply about emulating the specific histories of Iran or Cuba, but rather understanding specifically why those particular models worked there, so we ourselves can understand what we need? Okay. Helen or Sarah, feel free to respond to that question. It would be nice to hear from you both.
I'll give a fairly
Sure.
short answer. I mean, totally agree. Obviously, you know, the country's histories, the forms of resistance, the social forms of organization are all, you know, in different contexts. What I would say, however, is the more that countries talk to each other, the more that they can learn from each other. And remember that the US tends to operate with playbooks, right? So it's tried something out and it finds it successful, and the likelihood is it's going to follow the same playbook. And its playbook is economic warfare plus fostering domestic opposition. We've both talked about that. So we can see that that is, you know, a strategy that they adopt. It's, you know, their main strategy. So, you know, in each country that might be expressed or manifested in different ways. Of course, the class structures, the sort of power brokers in Iran are very different from Cuba. But what you can see, I mean, my point is really exemplified by the fact that we have this new phrase, right? Of the Venezuelan model. What does that mean? That means that Trump is so pleased with the success in Venezuela, where they totally illegally and with very little uproar internationally, like none. It's just kind of astonishing. They just went in, bombed 4 states, killed 120 people, kidnapped the president and his wife on phony charges, which then when, the drug trafficking thing all but disappeared when they appeared in front of the court. And so now, the journalists ask, this is the question to the president. Will you pursue the Venezuela model in Cuba? It's become a thing. So obviously the Cubans will be learning from that experience. It's worth saying that the fierce resistance that was put up to the kidnapping of Maduro, the president of Venezuela, came from the Cubans. 32 Cuban security personnel and associated roles were killed atrociously violently and put up a fierce resistance. Even Trump said, oh, they're a tough bunch. And the president of Cuba and all the leadership in Cuba has made this point. If that was the resistance they received from 32, then you can imagine what would await them if they try to attack 10 million. The Cubans have integrated national defense into their lives, like literally since little. And it shocks a lot of liberals because they go to Cuban schools and they say, why are the kids, crawling under tables? Oh, they're doing military training. But this has been part of Cuba's reality, right? Set up CDRs, street committees, in 1960 because of sabotage and bombings that were taking place by US funded interests in Cuba. And it has a sort of well-recognized national system of national defense, which it uses, as much for defending the population from hurricanes, but it's also there to defend the country from military attack. And certainly the Venezuelans were looking at what the Cubans were doing and setting up these Bolivarian defense committees. I think there's a big question about the response or the lack of it from the Bolivarian revolution to what happened in Venezuela, but that's a whole nother webinar. But I think that countries can learn from each other and they can also study the US playbook.
Thank you, Helen. Sara?
Totally agree with what was suggested and also what Helen was describing. I just want to add some points. Like when we are talking about the revolutionary struggles and anti-imperialist struggles, what comes at the center for many of us is the class struggle and, of course, understanding the economic ties, right? And what was also Helen mentioned about these playbooks, it's not just the economic relations or the direct violence. Everything that comes on media spotlight, we have to question that. I give you an example. For example, now the legacy media is saying that Iran violated the MOU because they have attacked some vessels. So what comes before that is that US and Oman actually violated the MOU by opening a new route in Strait of Hormuz. So who first violated goes to the dark, and what becomes in the lightest in the spotlight is what Iran did. So I'm giving you an example. This is happening in every global South country, and it's happening to every global South nation. Learning the playbook and then questioning whatever comes as journalism, as fact. Even the graphs. So this is something that we have to educate ourselves, like de-learn and relearn again. This is very important in the anti-imperialist movements, revolutionary movements, and talking about the history of each nation. For example, in the case of Iran, many Iranians believe that Iran was never colonized. Well, I have argued in a paper that part of Iran was actually colonized in the settler colonial manner when we are talking about the British oil. They actually controlled those areas. They occupied those areas through the two world wars, and the administration was by Brits. The living areas of Brits and Iranians and Indians was segregated, and all of that we've seen in African countries, in Asian countries that are known to be colonized happened in that area of Iran, but people do not know about that. And maybe this is the easy part. Just talk about the historical realities of your people, the struggles. Many people do not know about the struggles of Iranian, like prior to oil nationalization, and they say, "Oh, all started there." Why it started there? No, it has a history. How Iranian modern state was formed, and all of that. So I think it's on the shoulder of every revolutionary anti-imperialist movement to go through those histories and question whatever comes from the so-called neutral academia, global north academia, or media.
Thank you so much, Sara. We have two questions. One is from Vikar Ahmed, and the second question is from Imran Rasid. So, Vikar, could you please specify this question is for whom? And you can read it out so that everyone can benefit from hearing the question live. Go ahead. Could you please unmute yourself, Vikar?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. And a very good evening. Basically, I would like to address this question to two of these panelists because I found that during the conversation just a moment ago, two panel, especially Helen, have touched important of the economic sanction embargo. So of course, like for me, I extend this question with regards to the foreign policy of the United States state towards to Iran's Cuba and Venezuela. It is because back during the Bush administration time, Bush 2.0, he had mentioned that Iran's Cuba and North Korea is an effect if the evil axis to the world. But with regards to this, they are using which I describe as a bully diplomacy rather than a traditional statecraft. And how does economic coercion, sanction, and barbarous financial restriction functions as a substitute for direct military intervention in the modern geopolitics? Our ceasefire and negotiation is this context genuinely diplomatic breakthrough or temporarily pause as a symmetric power struggle? That's my question. Thank you.
So much, Vikar. Imran, could you please read out your questions, and then Sara and Helen can respond to those questions.
Right. Thank you.
Get
Thank you very much, Fadia. First of all, thank you very much for the speakers. I've learned a lot, and it somewhat put me in a very strange feeling. On one hand, I mean, I feel at awe because the things that the Cubans are doing and the Iranians are doing, the resilience that they're showing is inspiring and wonderful. But on the other hand, my feeling is that it makes me feel inadequate in Malaysia, that the things that we are doing are not enough. And I think there's a lot more that we should do to sort of push for more South-South cooperations and whatnot. Anyway, I'll go to my questions. One, I think, is on the questions of TCC or transnational capitalist class. Obviously, the sanctions are a bit more external. I mean, they are putting pressures externally through various measures, as you elaborate as well. But how does the Cuban model as well as the Iranian economic model deal or dealt with the danger of transnational capitalist class? Because there's always a risk for them to sort of capture the state and, of course, steer them towards a direction that are quite problematic as well. So that's one question, and that goes to both speakers. The second question, I think, is to Helen. I think the question of South-South cooperation, economic cooperation, I think is a long-standing question. It's always, I mean, it's there are all kind of, I mean, we have in the UN, you have the South-South cooperation body, and then you have the South Commissions, and all kind of ideas and measures are being proposed. But it seems to me that I think in today's context, where the imperialist aggressions are getting more and more amplified, do we have to rethink about what we need urgently when it comes to South-South cooperations? Or can it be like one or two agendas that the South can rally collectively? I mean, could de-dollarization would be the sort of agenda that should define the South-South cooperations at this point in time? So that's a question that I have for Helen.
So Helen or Sarah, you can start first.
Yeah, I'll start. So on this question, I mean the question of diplomacy, okay, for most of the, since 1961, 3rd of January, the US broke off diplomatic relations with Cuba. So and they were not restored until Obama at the end of 2014. No, actually summer 2015. So yeah, okay, so it's not traditional diplomacy, but if we wanted to use the term diplomacy of the bully, then we could certainly talk about the way that US uses its relationships with other countries to bully them into reinforcing the US blockade and sanctions. You said, what's this question? Are ceasefires and negotiations in these contexts genuine diplomatic breakthroughs or temporary pauses? So in relation to Cuba, this is one of the aspects that have driven the US policymakers mad, right? I mean, into fury. The Cubans have said, we will enter talks, even negotiations, but always on the basis of equality, respect for sovereignty, and respect for our differences. And the Cubans are reiterating that even with a gun to their heads right now, with this silent genocide in place, they are saying, as they always have said, and just so you're clear, they have always said this, right? The first Cuban revolutionary leader to reach out to the US and say, we'll talk, which was only a few months after they broke off diplomatic relations, was Che Guevara himself at the Organization of American States Summit in Uruguay in 1961. And he sent a Cuban cigar to the US representative and said, let's talk. And they met and talked. And, the Cubans have always been prepared to talk. Fidel Castro has said, and this just exemplifies their attitude, we have never accepted the right of the powerful or imperialist nations to have superiority, right? Just because they're big and imperialist nations. Like, we have never accepted that imperative. And so the Cuban position is, Raul Castro from 2008 talked about what we want is civilized coexistence. So, when Obama came along and they used the term rapprochement, normalization, the Cubans said, well, watch out for this. What do we mean by normalization? Because the normal relationship from the US perspective is that Cuba is a semi-colony. It's, basically a source for exploitation. And we're not going back. That's not the normal we want. Yeah. So the Cubans have been very clear. Miguel Diaz-Canel, with a gun to his head, with the threat of the Venezuelan model against him, has been made absolutely clear. We're open to talks. We will talk about any topic you want. You want to talk about human rights? We'll talk about human rights in Cuba and in the United States. We will talk about anything. But what's off the table is negotiations about our domestic, political, or economic system. That we will not negotiate. So I think that's the Cuban position. I hope that's answered your question there. In terms of the second question about the transnational capitalist class, I mean, here we have a very big difference between Cuba and Iran, right? Because
excuse me, I just wanted to stop you here. I just want to share this. On last Friday, I make a demonstration right in front of the U.S. Embassy to send a protest note but none of the US diplomats have accepted that note. And I can say that I have stands to defend Cuba, and also I have shown our Malaysian diplomacy with the United States with regards to Cuba, but US is failed in the diplomacy. This is a diplomacy of friendship, but they can't understand the meaning of this diplomacy. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, the US is not interested in equality between sovereign states. It's an imperialist nation, right? It has a functional relationship with other countries, and the function of other countries is that they are subject to exploitation to maintain the high standards of living and the, capital accumulation in the imperialist countries. We've just seen Elon Musk become a trillionaire. Right? He has more wealth than, I don't know, like, the half of the world, one individual. They're not interested. What they want is a system of global exploitation that permits that kind of inequality and capital accumulation. Why? Because capitalism is a system based on the pursuit of profit. As a Marxist, I would say, what is the source of profit? It's exploitation. It's just as simple as that. And this kind of links to your other question, the next question about transnational capitalist class and, the risk of capturing the state. For the Cubans, they, again, this is an irritation. Marco Rubio was being interrogated or put under pressure by another Cuban American, Maria Elvira Salazar, who was saying, why is it taking so long to see regime change in Cuba? This was a couple of weeks ago, maybe less. And she was saying, can't we use the Venezuelan model? Have we found someone to play the role of Vice President Delcy Rodriguez in Venezuela? And he had to admit, we can't find anyone. Cuba operates as a consensus state. Now, for Cuba, as a socialist country, what has given them control over the state is having the central plan, socialist centralized plan. And they have had control over a monopoly on trade, which means, even now when they're opening to investors, you're not just going to have like the scenario you see all over Latin America, all over the world, where, the most exploitative, polluting countries employing child labor aren't just going to turn up in Cuba. They cannot do that. It's all going to be facilitated through the state control. Right. So the concern of Cubans, Miguel Diaz-Canel has recently announced a new wave of reforms, of economic reforms, and making it easier for foreign investors and Cubans outside of Cuba to invest. But number one, this is a gradual process that actually was started around 2011 with Raul Castro's reform process, which I wrote about for my book. And number two, the state is not renouncing control of land, of property, or of conditions that foreign companies can operate. It needs foreign capital to get into the country so that they can, as I said, reinforce the system of social provision. And Sara said something that was that really struck, in terms of the issue with Cuba. What they're trying to do through economic sanctions is undermine the legitimacy of the state, because the state cannot fulfill its basic functions. Now, in Cuba, the basic, what Cubans think of as the functions of the state are a very high level of provision. Very high level, and it's extremely difficult under this sort of pressure to maintain that. Free healthcare and education. 90-something% of Cubans own their own home. If you pay rent, it can't be more than a few percent, less than 10% of your income. As a constitutional right, you have access to art, sport, and culture. It's extremely difficult. The Cuban state is no longer able to pick rubbish up from the street because they don't have fuel oil. But what they can do is control what happens with foreign capital coming into the country. And the announcement by Miguel Diaz-Canel, the president of these economic reforms, has led to a really vibrant, dynamic debate among Cubans. And a lot of Cubans are very concerned about these openings because they recognize that the state has control over the economy, and that protects them as workers, as mothers, as children, as people who receive free public healthcare and education and so on. So the Cubans are not going to relinquish that control even if the government was suggesting it. The population is not having it. And this is a highly mobilized, politically mobilized, highly educated population. They are very aware of the conditions they're operating in and how concessions have to be made in order to avoid the collapse of the state completely, right, and a silent genocide. And that's what those measures are about. In terms of rethinking South-South cooperation, I mean, there's one part of me that is horrified by the response of the global South to this oil siege. I mean, Angola is a country where 400,000 Cuban soldiers and civilians went to defend it from the invading army of apartheid South Africa, right? Angola, its independence was achieved with Cuban soldiers and Cuban fighters, yeah? Angola has oil. Where is the oil? How many countries? I said to you, Cuba has assisted in healthcare terms over 180 countries. Many of them have oil. Why haven't they sent oil? I think it's a disgrace. Cuba is an observer nation of the BRICS. What have the BRICS done to help Cuba to save it from a genocide? But we saw the precursor to this with Gaza. We had a genocide being carried out, which people watched live. They watched it live. And what did the world do? It was left to solidarity activists to sail on boats that then got attacked by Israel. And again, we're seeing now solidarity activists are going by boats or planes or any way they can to Cuba, which is another, the siege of Gaza, the blockade of Gaza. Cuba's had it for, as I said, nearly 7 decades. And there is another, it's called Nuestra America, Our America Global Convoy. Another one is going between the 10th and the 26th, I think, of August. So if that's something you're interested in, going to show your solidarity, these activists are taking solar panels, they're taking food and medicine, and that's a very practical way that you can support Cuba in this moment to also refuse to abide by this medieval siege. But, yes, the dollar, if the more countries that move away from the dollar and really create a feasible alternative international payment system rather than just between two countries or whatever, that is absolutely essential. And if Cuba cannot survive this siege, if Iran cannot survive this siege, then they'll just move on to another country. I mean, and I have to say this, they've talked about a military attack on Cuba. They've talked about the Venezuela model or worse. But actually, it is Iran and the fierce resistance and strategic resistance put up by the people of Iran, the government of Iran, has in many ways saved Cuba from what appeared earlier this year to be an imminent attack. Now, it doesn't mean that that attack is not on the cards, but I think what Iran has shown is that military superiority doesn't translate into a quick and easy victory. It may have in Venezuela, where the United States now controls the oil, although it doesn't control, the political relations on the street, but it controls the oil, and that's what it was after. But I think that lesson given by Iran has certainly, has been really important for Cuba. And let's hope they've learned their lessons. But given it's Trump, I wouldn't count on it.
All right. Thank you, Helen. Sara, and we have 2 more people who would like to ask questions. Maybe after Sara answers this question, we'll get these 2 questions to be posed to our speakers.
Thank you so much for your great questions about the traditional statecraft and the diplomacy of bully. I'm wondering, what is traditional statecraft? Because when we are talking about the 19th century, early 20th century, where 19th century is all about the imperial forces fighting each other and trying to fight over other people's land for their own benefits. where has this traditional statecraft was born? Are we talking about, I don't know, medieval time? Are we talking about Roman time? So when I try to find a real traditional, which means respecting the sovereignty of all powers involved, I cannot find a moment, even when we are talking about the formation of United Nations, we have to go through the League of Nations, which was basically those who could colonize other people coming to an agreement to one another that, okay, we have to come down. And then there was an anti-imperialist league at the same time, somehow resisting what they were trying to impose as normal, as universal, and as what everyone should follow. And the United Nations, we know that the how the movement made it a little bit by the Western powers and a little. Do you hear me now? I think I had an internet
Yes.
interruption.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. So when you go through uh, the contracts, for example, in Iran, like from 19th century onward, there is something on that paper that seems like what we have today, MOU, like what's visible to everyone. It seems that there are both sides are giving away their benefits and there are interests for both. But when you review the correspondences behind it, like for example, in the case of Iran's oil nationalization and what came after as the coup in 1953, I studied the 1,000 pages released by CIA in 2018, and you see how coordinated the USA was with Britain in every step. And if there were disagreements, it was disagreements between two almost imperial powers. Uh, and so, from my perspective, to be short, um, any kind of agreement, any kind of like deal or whatever Trump tries to call it, there are imperial bully diplomacy. All of them are bully diplomacy. And when you see, for example, in the last MOU, Iran has a little bit of leverage in that. It's because of the Iranian resistance. And we are witnessing it's not even a month after this MOU is signed, and we are seeing how it's being undermined by the US and, of course, by the Zionist entity in our region. And I think this is the case also for Cuba. Maybe they have not signed any agreements recently with USA, but I'm sure also, even if there are leverages given to Cuba or Venezuela, there is always uh, a strategy behind that. This is the imperial playbook. I don't want to portray them as omnipotent, but what's important is to know that they have hundreds of years of experience through the processes of colonization and then imperialism in the 20th century. And we don't have that playbook. So let's be realistic. The global South nations do not have those think tanks for 100 years who gave these imperial nations to overview all the possibilities, how they can actually deceive other nations, how they can use the international governance vocabulary and all this to actually pursue what they are planning for. So from the day one that there was talks between Iran and US, I think many were pessimistic about the outcomes. And of course, in Iran, like any other global South country, we have this toxified people. We have liberal minds who think that Europe and US can lead the country to development and to prosperity. And of course, we can find those people among the elite. So it's not like that everyone in Iranian government, Iranian states, or Iranian academia agrees on the points of the diplomacy of the bully. But I think it's important to precisely shed light on what this is historically and also in the current situation. And about the transnational capitalist class, well, it's very complicated in Iran talking about this class because it's more than 20 years that Iran has been sanctioned. And even after the revolution, the main industries in the country were nationalized, and later on, in the 90s, Iran opened up to the so-called globalization. The neoliberal policies were implemented in the country. And we saw here and there some transnational companies being involved, but never more than 50% of shares. So what I'm trying to say is that the experience of the revolution, the experience of the war, and later on the sanctions have decoupled the Iranian economy from transnational capitalist class in a way. What is important is that in this process of sanctions, there is a new class born inside Iran. You can call them brokers, you can call them shadow men. Those people who can actually trade with dollar in UAE, in other countries in the region, or in Asia, but there is all these transactions are done in shadows. Maybe in Iran there is less danger of transnational capitalist class to change the formation of government. But these people, these shadow men, these brokers on a very large scale who are somehow handling the sale of Iranian oil, Iranian petrochemical industry, Iranian steel. And because this is like informal in a way also inside Iran, there are very few information about how these processes actually are working, how powerful these people are, how connected are these people to different factions of the state. So here and there you hear rumors, but less and less reliable information on these people. And we can say that they may have the power to shift the power dynamics within the Iranian states, this specific class in the country. I stop here.
Thank you so much, Sara. Maybe one last question from our audience. Tong, could you please pose the question to the speaker?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Fadia. I just wanted to say that about a week or so ago, there was a forum in Kuala Lumpur where you yourself and Dr. Fadia was a speaker as well, where there were speakers that raised the Cuban ambassador to Malaysia, as well as the Iranian cultural ambassador, together with a Malaysia-based Palestinian researcher. So we had speakers from Cuba, Iran, and Palestine, who shared a platform speaking from that shared experience in a way, in a sense. My takeaway from that, one could say, was that the resistance, the resilience, the steadfastness that these speakers represented in standing against domination and imperial hegemony. One wonders, what percentage of the so-called global majority are even aware the debt to which they owe these resistance fighters, if you will, against global domination. I felt that there was a need, as there was a gap, rather. There's a gap between the level at which that resistance is being waged, for decades up to a century. A gap between that and the lack of general awareness of members of the public as to the debt, in a sense, to which they owe these resistance fighters or entities. How does one try and close that gap? How does one raise the awareness, the consciousness of people in general society that can bring pressure to their own governments, including in this case Malaysia, where the forum was held? How do we bring that level of awareness and consciousness up so that there is some bottom-up pressure on their respective governments to engage more actively in what have been significant shortfalls in the way in which the Global South has responded, or rather the lack of response to be the genocide in Gaza, or the continued oppression of Cuba, or the downright violence that's being visited upon Iran. So that's the question, and I thought I'd also add in one remark, which is not a question. In my own experience, where I have to some extent worked on the Palestine issue, and then linking it to the colonial threats, the colonial imperial threats that tie Palestine to all the other areas of subjugation. I work with people who are in Malaysia. I also work with people who are not in Malaysia. And sometimes I encounter another sort of gap where if it is someone from the West, it is fine to talk about at a global level about global imperialism. They will be critical of that. But when it comes to then trying to link that or ground that down to the local landscape being one where we have our own respective post-colonial legacies, linking it, grounding it to our own experience, and then from that forming or configuring our response to, be it Palestine or Cuba or Iran. There's a certain lukewarmness from some Westerners to together with the locals, ground it into a local landscape and then reconfigure the challenge to imperialism accordingly. So that's a remark, but it's not a question that I raised earlier on.
Thank you so much, Tong. Helen and Sara, feel free to respond to that question.
Sorry, I was so interested in your remark that I forgot your question. What was the question?
Oh, the question was, the question is really part rhetorical and part substantive. That's the perennial gap, the perennial challenge of how
Yes.
does one try to raise awareness in terms of bringing pressure from ground up.
Yeah. Okay, so in relation to your remark, I mean, I think I totally understand where you're coming from, right? So I am an anti-imperialist. I'm a Marxist. I've been involved in activism despite or as well as being an academic. And the position, my focus is on Cuba. If any of you have looked at the position of the majority of the left in Britain, and it's similar to, it's not so bad. It's actually worse in Britain than other countries in Europe and the United States, but they are very reactionary on Cuba. They essentially don't support the Cuban Revolution. They don't acknowledge the gains of the revolution. They say it wasn't the self-emancipation of the working class because, it doesn't fit their model. They're very dogmatic schema of how social transformations take place. So my remark to that is I would encourage you to read a fairly new book that came out earlier this year by Gabriel Rockhill, Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism? And it shows the role of leftists, some call themselves Marxists and some don't, who within the, imperialist countries, Western imperialist countries. And I think it shows the mechanisms that the state has used, sometimes through direct payment, but otherwise by doing things like I described when I talked about Cubanology and I talked about the paradigm within which you have to work, and how the state has allowed left views to be expressed, but it has steered them towards towards being anti-Marxist or anti-communist and against, states that use violence for their own national liberation, right? So also in relation to Palestine, for example. On the other question about, how can we close the gap? How can we essentially make global populations more aware of what has been achieved in the frontline role against imperialism of like Cuba and Iran, Venezuela, other countries? I think, what I've done I'm fortunate enough to have managed to get a job in academia that also supports my activism. And I've used that position to write books that are, directed towards the public and to produce documentaries. I've co-produced 3 documentaries about Cuba, one about Cuba and COVID, one about Cuba and climate change, its response to climate change, which is, for mass dissemination so that you counter that, what we were talking about, Sara and I were talking about in relation to Cuba and Iran, the sort of demonization of those countries and turning them into pariah states and showing some of the extraordinary things. And, my work on Cuban biotechnology has made clear that we in Britain and other countries in the United States, people are dying from diabetic foot ulcers when the Cubans have a drug that reduces the need for amputations by 72%. Again, with their lung cancer. So it's also, appealing to people's self-interest in a way and saying what these countries have done. But I would also, a few years ago, I would have said, activism is so important. We need to be organized. We need to be on the street. But it's just this peculiar reality that around the world, millions of people were on the street for Gaza against the genocide. And, we didn't manage to stop it. We did not manage to stop it. So I think in terms of, I did an interview with Abby Martin, who someone posted in the chat, has recently produced a documentary interviewing the president of Cuba. And we asked her that. We asked her about that. How can you explain that millions were on the street for Gaza? And we haven't seen anything like that for Iran or for Cuba, right? And, her response is, well, there's the problem, right? Millions were on the street. We didn't stop the genocide. So the movement is kind of re-strategizing and it's saying, how can we be more effective? And one result is the convoys, the flotillas, the flotilla to Gaza and now the convoy to Cuba, to sort of force governments to respond to you by taking direct action. So it's quite hard to explain, but, education events like this are really important because this was, publicly advertised. I put it on my Facebook. Maybe there's some people here who saw it. But I think it's just having, getting information. They say knowledge is power. So we need to arm ourselves with that knowledge. And that's all I can say.
Thank you so much, Helen. As Fidel said, battle of ideas. Okay, Sara, if you could respond to the last question. I have been asked by the organizer to conclude after this. Yes.
Yes. That's, as Helen also said, that's a great question. I can talk of my own experience. I was also someone, when I was in my youth, like 20 years old, I also thought that the West is really something that is like, moving forward in history, and we are behind, like developing, underdeveloped, and all of that. It was internalized. And I was lucky to actually go to Europe and live in Europe for about 14 years. And knowing the West actually changed me. So I think for many Iranians, I'm also trying it at university, and all the young people that I see here, and this works. This works. An image of a British merchant sitting on the back of a Bengali woman works more than 20 pages of a paper to say that they were colonial powers and they were violent. And when they are talking about women rights in Iran, this is their history. And now this is what they are doing to Palestinian mothers. Images, like now the use is very much linked to images. And well, of course, we also need to have this kind of epistemological authority to do that, of course, right? And many in Iran view me as a socialist or left person, like already delegitimized. So we have to use like political methods. Um, and as I said, in my own experience, knowing the West, like they have a high culture. No, they don't. I mean, uh, look at the Egyptians, look at the Malaysians, look at the Chinese, look at the Iranians, and how they treat the human beings. And what I've experienced, no offense to any like single person, right? I'm talking about what they have sold to people of the South to legitimize themselves. The knowledge is being produced there. They are the head of science. So, for example, what I talk about is like, well, what they are talking about, they have advanced the science. It was built on the shoulders what was already existed in India, in China, and in the Islamic empire of the time. So all of this with visual materials, with showing like the history of colonialism and the lies that are being told, I think helps a lot. At least the next time they turn on BBC or I don't know, New York Times and say like Iran is a rogue state, there is like a question mark around that. Like, why is Iran a rogue state, or why Cuba is a socialist, like kind of a villain of the world? There is a question mark at least. Unfortunately, they were way more successful with all the money, all the um, networks that they have, the capitalist class and also the imperialist state, in winning the hearts and minds of people, the people's majority in the world, not only in the global north, but also in the global south. So it's hard work, and it's going to be a long way. But I think we can start from imposing the lies.
All right, thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Sarah. On behalf of the organizers, I would like to thank Sarah and also Helen for sharing your analyses of the ways in which US imperialism operates in both Cuba and Iran. And these analyses are important in informing us how do we formulate strategies that would be effective to dismantle US imperialism and build a socialist future. Thank you so much, everyone. I would like to hand over the floor to our MC, Umaira.
Thank you, Fadia. I would love to take this opportunity to personally thanks Fadia, Dr. Helen, Sarah, first for your willingness to accept the invitation. I didn't expect actually all of you were willing to join this event. And second, for this informative and really fruitful discussion tonight. Because I believe that today's session opened up much needed and grounded discussion. And in this short time, we tried to discuss the policy, diplomacy, and also we didn't forget about the people. So thank you again for all the panel, the moderator, and also for all the participants. I see people coming from if I'm not mistaken, from Bangladesh, from Nigeria, from Malaysia, Indonesia. So I really appreciate the variation of the participation. And on behalf of Citizen International, I thank you once again for all the participation and wish a pleasant day ahead. And I just would like to to share that if any of you have idea for collaboration of future event, please don't hesitate to contact Citizen International through Instagram, email, and any platform. We are willing for further collaboration. So thank you again, everyone, and have a good day, or for Malaysian, have a good night, maybe. So bye and assalamualaikum.
Thank you so
Thank,
much.
Thank you so
thank
much.
you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.